This is People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. In each episode, writer and educator Sandy Carlson talks with a person who has been influenced by poetry and become a poet or a supporter of this literary form. Stay tuned.
First poem I wrote, part of my brain was saying, what are you doing writing a poem? You don't like poetry. And I was saying, shut up, I gotta write this. I love just associative leaps in a poem. They're like, when they land, it's like, wow, how'd we get here? I'm not writing to an audience 100 years from now, hoping, I have no delusions that anyone will be reading my poems 100 years from now.
Welcome to People and Their Poems podcast. I'm your host, Sandy Carlson, and I'm here today with Jack Powers. Jack taught high school, special education, English, and writing for 38 years. He won the 2015 and 2012 Connecticut River Review Poetry Contests. Jack earned MFAs in fiction and poetry from Sarah Lawrence College and a BFA in painting from Syracuse University. He has two poetry collections, Everybody's Vaguely Familiar, 2019, and Still Love, 2023. Jack has published scores of poems in various journals, including Rattle, the Cortland Review, and the Southern Review. His books are all available on Amazon. And you can find out more about Jack on Facebook as well as at his website. And we will post a link in the podcast notes for our listeners. Welcome, Jack.
Oh, thanks. Thanks for inviting me. As I was saying before, this is a great idea. And your great, the conversation, the podcast I listen to is just listening to great conversations. I hope I can meet the standard.
Oh, no doubt in my mind, Jack. So tell us about how you came to poetry. You've got such an interesting and rich educational and professional background. Where does poetry come into the scene for you?
Well, I'm kind of a accidental poet. I think in listening to the other podcasts, people talk about how much they love poetry as a child. I don't even remember reading nursery rhymes or anything. And I read a lot of fiction, cereal boxes, everything but poems. And then in high school and college, poems were things that usually they were old poems read by professors who then told me what it meant. Usually in my papers, I was guessing what it meant and they told me I was wrong. One actually said, no, you're wrong. I wrote my doctoral thesis on these poems. I was like, well, why did you ask me then? You already had figured this out. So once I started teaching, I was trying to figure out how to help my kids write. And I had a self-contained special ed class. I was teaching them everything. And I started going up to workshops at Bard College, their Institute of Writing and Thinking. And they would use a lot of poems in their workshops because you could read a poem. You'd have time to read a poem, to talk about it, to write something your own. And I wrote a lot with my students, and we wrote mostly personal essays initially because they had some pretty good stories to tell. And then we started making stuff up and we ran out of stories. And then I was in a MFA for fiction at Sarah Lawrence, and I took a few poetry craft courses thinking I needed to work on my language, and started thinking, oh, maybe I can hang with the poets. And it really was after that, my life kind of got complicated between family and work. I didn't have time to write the long fiction pieces I wanted, and I started writing poetry regularly. But first poem I wrote, part of my brain was saying, what are you doing writing a poem? You don't like poetry. And I was saying, shut up, I got to write this. Since then, I've been pretty all in on poetry with some attempts at novels, but mostly writing a lot of poetry.
That's interesting that poetry and poets' muses insisted on you as their vehicle for the story that you told. I've taken workshops with the Bard Institute of Writing and Thinking for years now, and I love them because the experience of them is so different from what you described as a student, where the academic telling you what it means. I love the way the Bard strategies invite the reader to have an authentic experience by trusting your own reading mind.
Yeah.
So I guess that voice got the last word with you in poetry then, right? To go ahead and trust yourself and get the poem written.
Yeah. And also I think the poems they chose. One of the ones I'm going to read the poem I'm going to read as an influential poem came from there. And I remember in the workshop when they finished, I was like, poems could be funny. I could do that. That sounds like fun. And I knew my students too wanted to have fun. Often when they would read, we'd write for 15 minutes. I say, anybody want to share? And they would read this long story. There were like 3 sentences on the page. They're like 10 minutes later. But it was a great story. So I wasn't interrupting them. And we were engaged in, reading and writing and thinking and they were excited to be in school for a change. So I owe a lot to Bard. That was just a great experience and great, still going on, Institute of Writing and Thinking.
And the whole experience really demystifies the text, right? Instead of being this maybe lofty and venerable, but it's not devoid of humanity or human experience. And part of being alive and being human is laughter, and it can be celebratory. Jack, would you read the poem that
Sure.
influenced you as a writer?
So the poem I chose, and this is really hard. I enjoyed the process, but I've got a couple of runner-ups, but the one I chose it, I think, because of how its long-term impact, I think. And plus, I still like to read the poem. So it's a poem by David Wagner, and it's called My Physics Teacher. He tried to convince us that his billiard ball fell faster than his ping pong ball and thumped to the floor first, in spite of Galileo. The rainbows from his prism skidded off screen before we could tell an infra from an ultra. His hand crank generator refused to spit sparks and settled for smoke. The dangling pith ignored the attractions of his amber wand, no matter how much static he rubbed and dubbed from the seat of his pants. And the house brick he lowered into a tub of water lost more weight, eureka, than the overflow. He believed in a world of laws where problems had answers, where tangible objects and intangible forces acting thereon could be lettered, numbered, and crammed through our tough skulls for lifetimes of homework. But his only uncontestable demonstration came with our last class. He broke his chalk on a formula, stooped to catch it, knocked his forehead on the eraser gutter, staggered, slew foot, and stuck one foot forever into the wastebasket.
That's great. So, Jack, why did that poem resonate with you? Why did that make the cut in picking one poem?
Well, initially, as I said, I thought, oh, poems could be funny. Maybe I could write poems after all. And I think it's very accessible. In my thinking, I was really there as a teacher first. So I was like, oh, my kids are going to love this poem right here. And it also it stands up, not just a rereading, but kind of looking at it seems simple, but then like the whole first section, it's very sonnet-like. I just realized recently, it presents all of this list of things he failed to do, and then he believed in, we get a little bit of what he believed in, and then we get the but, that scene at the end, which is both hysterical and, as a teacher, a nightmare. That's
right.
This is exactly what you fear as a teacher. You're going to be teaching something, the kids don't get any of it. You just look like, you're completely incompetent. And then you just leave them with this, Charlie Chaplin image of you at the end. I mean, what a nightmare. But at the same time, the, wise ass student in me can laugh at it. And I also think the opening is just like the billiard ball, ping pong, skidded screen, infra, ultra, pith, rubbed and dubbed. The eureka is in parentheses, which I didn't know you could do in a poem. It's like a one-man band of sound play. There's just so much, it's just so much fun to listen to. So the way it moves, the way it sounds, and it's funny, and it ends with that image at the end. And it was so consistently well received by students that if they didn't laugh at the end, I realized they were like asleep or something. And I would stand up and I would act out the last scene. And then they'd be like, wait, read it again. We missed that. They could always think of, I'd say, does this remind you of any teachers that you may have had? And they're all like, they start naming names. I don't want to name names, but just in case they listen to this podcast, but and then they just go right to work. So it achieved everything I wanted in a class. We could laugh together and then we'd write together.
And the fun of language, when you were working with your students and they were writing their narrative pieces or doing those just free writes or what have you, did you find that as they engaged poems like this one, that they also were engaging language in a different way and less let the words find me and let me go choose them?
Yep. And they and I always said, you do not have to share whatever you're writing. It's going to be volunteer only. I'm going to expect you to be sharing at some point, but write freely. Don't write with me in the class looking over your shoulder. So you could just play. And like the sound play stuff, I think for a lot of kids, they really enjoyed that. So that's what they would take from it. I had kind of a workshop. I've done it 1,000 times. It's basically how to, steal from other people's poems. And one of them is like the poem idea, which I stole from Where'd You Get That Red, Kenneth Koch. And like write about a teacher who thought they were teaching one thing and taught something very different, and write about any teacher story, or write a story about, I love all the science words. It never would have occurred to me. I wrote a couple of poems that were just like science terms I love. You don't think of science terms as being sound oriented, but there's a lot of great sounding science terms. And then the form of it, they could take ideas from the form of it, and then just sort of techniques like the sound play and the alliteration and the internal rhyme and everything. So I kind of point to those things, and they could play with them and put them together. And what appealed to them and what they stole was unique to their sensibility, and they would all take different things and write very different poems out of it. So this is really one that I've come back to many, many times because it's so rich for theft.
Absolutely. And as a teacher, that horrifying moment when that clumsy thing happens and you do violence to yourself inadvertently, I think we've all been there. And teachers have probably been on both sides of that experience, and it's very relatable.
You teach in high school, college? Where do you teach?
I teach high school English. I usually have freshmen, and we do a lot of work with the epics, Gilgamesh and the Odyssey.
Yeah. Those are harder to share in one session and then write.
Yeah, they do take longer, but I think the fun of those texts is that they are big adventure stories,
right,
with larger than life characters making enormous mistakes, and nevertheless finding their way home to a better place. And usually the girls don't forgive Odysseus for his infidelities. He will not be redeemed, but all the kids love Gilgamesh for his adventures. He does unforgivable things as well, right. But I think those big lessons are there, that you can come back from a big loss or a big mistake and be better for it if you keep pushing.
You're going to go out and do some dumb things you'll regret. Just keep going. Yeah. And
I don't let them lose sight of the fact that the hero comes back middle-aged, that it is about life, not just a moment, Yeah. So Jack, I'm curious, what are some of the topics of your poem? You talked about narrative and accessible everyday experiences. What are the topics of your poems? What do you like to dig into?
I do like things that come from, everyday life, or the headlines, or my experience, or observing others, rather than, big topics. Maybe that's still my aversion to poetry that I had in high school and college, that they would all have to be about something big and important. Like those things tend to come out anyways, and I think they're more interesting if you don't start with them. My first book was kind of a memoir in verse. Looking experiences in my childhood, and I grew up with two grandmothers, and I was not the best behaved child or teenager, and then sort of start from there and see where they go. So my goal always is to try to be surprised, to end up somewhere that I didn't start out. I had a teacher, Diana Getch, who said, if I've merely executed a plan, I've failed. Like to write towards surprise. So the beginning is usually starts with something I think might be an interesting story, or it's curious, or I want to learn more about it. But then I try to write in a way that I don't have my hands firmly on the steering wheel, and I can just, let's see where it goes. But they tend to be really narrative. I think you could probably tell I started out as a fiction writer.
Right.
And I love personal essays. I think that some of them are sort of, I can be accused of writing personal essays with line breaks. So, I mean, those are influences. And my second book, I tried to write shorter poems because you get poems in your email every day. I get some from Rattle.
Yeah.
From poem.org. And there's just so many days where I open it and it's a long one. I'm like, I don't have time for this. So I thought, I'm doing this to readers all the time. So I started writing shorter poems, and I wanted to write poems where I was getting out of my own life a little more, observing others and their lives. And I kind of have a fascination with old people, and having retired, I started thinking, wait, I think I'm an old person. There's a lot of old people in the second book, kind of looking for how they deal with it, how they deal with age.
I can relate to that. In my mom's family, people tend to live long times and remember things, and the stories are so entertaining and insightful, and I did a little poetry group with our senior center in town in the spring and summer last year. And, I have such great experiences of sitting with people who have lived it,
right,
and are happy to sit and talk about poetry, having lived it. And it would give me a totally different perspective on the things that would get me all cranked up at work or in the store. It's like, you can leave that by. Can I ask you, who do you write with an audience in mind? And who is your audience?
Well, initially, I think I was influenced a lot by that. I did most of my writing with a bunch of 16, 17, 18-year-olds.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's still remnants of that I want them to be able to read my poems and have access to them, and be amused or surprised or whatever. But I think that I've grown up a little bit, and I have shifted to. I mean, first I've got to keep myself engaged, which sounds selfish, but I think that it's just a fact that you have to, if I'm getting bored, the reader's going to get bored. And so actually a lot of what I've tried to do, this is why my poems got longer, is I love just associative leaps in a poem that are like, when they land, it's like, wow, how'd we get here? And then it shifts, and I love that in a poem. So that's probably an older audience, but mostly I'm writing to people, friends, and I have a writing group that I've met with for 35 years. I'm very influenced by writing things for them. We've just been meeting maybe 6 years. I'm not sure how many years. So you kind of, those are, how they respond to poems. I think about that, but I'm not writing to an audience 100 years from now, hoping. I have no delusions that anyone will be reading my poems 100 years from now.
And will the earth be here in 100 years from now? It may be a moot point at the rate we're going. So that's just interesting. I hear what you're saying about the people around you being your audience and the people that you're writing for. And I think that's a tremendously rich gift for them to receive that. And it's also deeply personal, because poetry comes from a very personal place, based on our experiences and emotions and our experience of language. Could you just say a little bit more about belonging to a writing group for 35 years? That's pretty substantial. During
my early years of teaching, when I was desperate. See, you read my bio. I was an art major, and then I was trying to get a job doing something else, writing advertising copy and subbing, just so I could have a job that I, could say I can't come in today, I have an interview. And after about 3 months, I was like, writing advertising copy is really boring. This job I do during the day is really fun. So I got into teaching, but got certified in special ed, was teaching English and math, basically whatever they needed, based on my high school experience. So I went back to get certified in math and English, went to Bard, and I did a summer institute of the Connecticut Writing Project, which was the most influential thing, by far the best thing I ever did as a teacher. And out of that group, a couple of us were saying, I know I've done this before. I'll go home and say, I'm going to get up every morning at 5 and I'll write. And we never would. So we knew we needed deadlines and response. So we said, okay, let's meet in a month at my house, and named a date. And so that was 1986. And so we've done that. We don't leave without naming a new date. And the group is turned over. There's just two of us, two original members left, but the new members all come from the writing project. So if somebody leaves for one reason or another, we just talk to whoever head of the writing project, or I'm still kind of involved, so I know people. And so it's always been made up of writing project teachers. And so that's 6 years ago.
Could you say a little bit about the Connecticut Writing Project for the benefit of our listeners?
Okay, so it's part of the National Writing Project, and also it's very Bard-like, Institute of Writing and Thinking like that. It's the premise is that you will, you learn by doing, by modeling, you write with your students, you try to get them, it's very constructivist. I think the initial piece, I think, was to try to you had all of these researchers in college coming up with this research, and you had all of these teachers in high school doing their best to make it through the day, and there was no connection. So the writing project was developed to connect the colleges and the schools, the teachers to the professors to the research. And so a lot of it is very research based and very experiential. And it's really misnamed. It's the Reading, Writing, Thinking Project. Have you had any experience with the writing project, or
I have not, no. But you have me curious, because I can relate to the situation you're describing where theory and practice live in their own little silos, and it sounds like a great opportunity to break through old thinking and to reconsider what's happening in a classroom when kids are writing, because I think they always ask legitimate questions about why they're doing what they're doing and what ultimate purpose it can serve. But I have written with my students, and I have found that to be really powerful. I did a lot of that during the pandemic with the juniors I had, and it just changes the climate in the group tremendously, because it humanizes the teacher.
So I had all these behavior problems. So instead of me standing over them saying, you need to write for 5 more minutes, I'm writing with them saying, wait, could you hold on? I got to finish this. Could you just write a little more? It just changed the dynamic in the classroom, that we were in it together and sharing things more. Not like I was completely giving up the authority, but it changed it where it wasn't me forcing to do something that I wasn't doing.
Did they have the opportunity to give you feedback on your work as well?
And they would give me really good feedback. They would tell, like, what, you lost me there, or what's this, or what it, especially I think that I still think the smallest words are the best words. I try to avoid jargon and big fancy vocabulary in my writing. And a lot of that is from them, because it would just get in the way. And I still feel that way. That sometimes I get lost in a poem like, are you just showing off? Where are you going with this? But I think the other thing, and this is like Bard, people who are willing to go to Bard for the weekend for one of these workshops, and people who are willing to go to the writing project for 3 or 4 weeks in the summer, it's a self-selecting group. You get people that are smart, high energy, committed. So just the people I was allowed to hang out with because of those experiences, both at Bard and in the writing project. And I just wanted to hang out with them. I just learned an incredible amount. And, I gave a lot of workshops for them, and I try to be on the board. Sometimes I taught the Summer Institute a few years. It's just amazingly energetic. There's just, as you know, in a school that there can be, the people that will come into the faculty room and say, everybody thinks they're an individual. I'm like, I think they are, aren't they? Like they're all like, and kids, I'm like, it's so easy to get sucked into that. So
Right.
my writing group, once a month, I met with these people that were doing really cool stuff, were really interested, didn't have it all figured out, but were constantly trying things. Half the time their poems were based on something they did in class with kids, and I just say, send me that lesson, and so it just made me a much better teacher, but it also kept me energized and positive and, focused on what's amazing about teaching.
I hear you. And I think one of the other great things about Bard, it is, and like an instant kinship with the people that you're sitting with, because they've chosen to be there, because that's where they're spending that end of the week. You're going to get home late, the whole thing. And then you also realize that your experiences, even if you're in an urban school and they're in a rural school, private school, parochial, whatever, kids are kids, and what we're trying to accomplish with them about a love of language, and that it's an incredible resource that they can harness, that it isn't beyond anybody. It just requires practice and a meaningful approach, is very energizing. I so admire the way you applied those things in your classroom, and I think being in a writing group or sharing our writing, whether it's published and bound or on a printed page or in a notebook, requires humility and vulnerability, because how are they going to react? How are they going to take it? There's a lot of risk involved in that. And I think that can really transform relationships. So to continue with that for so many years is really, really admirable.
Well, it was fun. I have a great writing group, but it really did help energize my teaching in a positive. I just got so much out of it.
And I remember the experiences like you described of the authoritarian English teacher telling you what it means. And, in English, there's no answer in the back of the book, and you're always playing that game, and that you can have an authentic experience of a story as you are, for who you are, is so validating and so important to letters. And I've had the privilege of hearing you read your poems, Jack, in a couple online settings, and the things you do with language and the narrative elements that you bring into the poems about family and experience are really wonderful. Would you share some of your writing with our listeners now?
So this comes from the new book called Still Love. It's kind of a collection of portraits. It started out, as I said, as sonnets and looking at other people, but I can't follow my own directions, and they turned into semi-sonnets and came back to my life. So this one is a little more, it's longer and more about my own experience. And it's called, Where Was Your Mother? Hors d'oeuvres, I said, and placed a bowl of grapes on the table. Mom, Ellen, and Granny must have looked at me strange, but I was focused on making dinner. Cheeseburgers on cinnamon and sugar-coated English muffins, I narrated as I worked Mom's electric grill. Why did I feel so confident when the friends I'd smoked angel dust with had all freaked out? I focused on getting a little char on the burgers while keeping the middle pink, timing the muffins browning on our little toaster, slicing the tomato. As my friends wandered Guy's yard crying or lay on his living room floor mumbling at their hands, I decided I needed to ride home and cook dinner. Dad was away, so I wouldn't get his "are you stoned again" look, and Mom could probably use a break. And who wouldn't love grapes and burgers? I scented the burgers on muffins and tomatoes on beds of iceberg, and presented each plate with a silent voila, then sat beside them and dug in, and saying, "Delicious, right?" It was. 25 years later, at our group 40th birthday party, Dan's wife, Michelle, kept interrupting our crazy stories with, "Where was your mother?" Most of the time, Mom was busy trying to live her own life and following the don't ask, don't tell policy that kept us from arguing all the time. But for the bowl of grapes dinner, she was sitting to my left. Did she look at her wild-eyed teen son, hair in a frizzy ponytail, and think, should I call someone? Granny laughed at my ums, ate, probably thinking I'd be a chef instead of the priest she'd hoped for. Ellen was probably trying to divert attention from my cryptic babbling and long silences. But Mom, she was a child of the Depression, an adult of the Eisenhower years. The hippies and drugs of the 60s were beyond her understanding. Or was I selling her short? During my delinquent phase in 7th grade, she used to save things up. Can I sleep at Tommy's? I asked once on a car ride home. I'd been really good. What about, she asked, trying to set old Greenwich School on fire? We weren't, I said. It was just a little fire to burn the... We put it out, I said, remembering all the steam rising from our pee that brought the fire trucks. Mom turned her eyes back to the road with a little smile. She knew me pretty well. I think I knew when my own kids were stoned, though it could have been the surliness of teenhood. Would I have interrupted a surprise dinner of grapes and burgers to let them know I knew? I hope not. After the plates were scraped clean, I noticed the half-filled bowl. The grapes are dessert too, I said. What symmetry. We each grabbed one, bit into the tart green skin. I imagined simultaneous explosions of sweetness in our mouths. We looked out the window at the yellow forsythia, the squirrels playing in the giant oak, the tomatoes and corn I'd planted in the garden, all lost in our own thoughts. Where was my mother? Right beside me the whole time.
There's that surprise you were talking about. Thanks, Jack. Wow. I never had quite that kind of a burger before, but I can relate to that sense of being together and yet in our own worlds at the same time.
I think it's the cinnamon sugar on the English muffin bun that really, you got to try it. I recommend it.
is the recipe, well, the recipe's in the poem, so that people want to try your recipe out.
I never thought of that. It's a recipe poem.
That's great. Jack, it's been a delightful conversation with you, and I just love how down to earth you are in your writing and in your thoughts about the writing process and where ideas come from. I really appreciate the perspective that you brought to the conversation about poetry today. So thank you so much for your time.
Well, thank you for inviting me and talking to me. I love this series. It was great talking to you. Thank you.
This has been People and Their Poems, a podcast about the poems that make a difference in our world. Be sure to check the show notes for any special links relating to this episode. If you want to learn more about the podcast, visit peopleandtheirpoems.net. Or if you want to learn more about Sandy and her work, visit sandycarlson.net. Thanks for listening.